In November 1519, inside the imperial palace of Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II consumed 50 golden goblets a day of a pitch-black, bitter liquid seasoned with chili and wildflowers, not a dessert, but a divine currency of war. Right now, sitting on your kitchen counter, wrapped in thin aluminum foil and flooded with refined sugar, is the domesticated descendant of that exact same imperial ledger. You snap off a square without thinking. You let it melt on your tongue for comfort. You buy it at the supermarket checkout line for a handful of loose change. But the substance you are holding was born as a brutal instrument of state power. It was not a sweet treat. It was an extraction of tribute enforced by obsidian blades and standing armies. For centuries across Mesoamerica, consuming this crushed, fermented seed was a privilege restricted entirely to the high military command, the priesthood, and the imperial nobility. The dark, frothing drink they consumed carried the smell of damp earth and the sharp bite of raw spice. It left a film of fat on the teeth and a jolt of alkaloids in the blood. To drink it was to consume the captured territory of subjugated provinces. How did an elite military currency of blood and empire become a cheap, sugary commodity wrapped in foil? By mechanically crushing its sacred essence, bleaching out the bitterness, and shifting the brutality from the Aztec altar to the hidden plantations of the modern supply chain. This transformation from sacred tribute to corporate product makes me wonder what other everyday item in your pantry is hiding an empire's ledger. Tell me in the comments which food I should investigate next. To understand what chocolate actually is, you have to strip away the industrial conditioning. You have to look at the botanical anatomy of the cacao tree itself. It does not grow in neat, predictable rows like wheat or corn. It requires the suffocating humidity and perpetual shade of the equatorial canopy. The tree produces thick, heavy pods that erupt directly from its trunk, hanging there like swollen organs. When you slice open one of these heavy pods, you do not find anything resembling a familiar confection. You find a dense, pale flesh. It is fibrous and wet. Suspended inside that white pulp are the seeds themselves, purple and dormant, resembling nothing so much as clotted veins. The peoples of the Valley of Mexico recognized this biology for what it was. In the cosmology of the region, the pod was literally equated with the human heart. The physical act of breaking the husk, tearing out the white flesh, and extracting the bitter seeds mirrored the mechanics of ritual sacrifice. It was an anatomical parallel woven directly into the theology of the state. The liquid extracted from those crushed seeds was viewed as the physical blood of the earth, a dark fluid that acted as a botanical bridge to the underworld. It was the substance that fueled the gods, and by extension, the emperors who commanded in their name. Because it was sacred, it was scarce. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan sat on a high-altitude lakebed. The climate there was too cold, the air too thin to cultivate the fragile tree. Every single seed consumed in the palace had to be hauled by foot across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. It had to be extracted as a tax from conquered coastal territories. The sheer logistical friction of moving heavy sacks of seeds through the jungle without beasts of burden transformed the plant into a physical measurement of power. You did not just drink the flavor of the seed, you drank the crushed labor of the porters, the siege of the coastal cities, and the iron will of the central government. The biology of a sacred fruit was hardening into a terrifying financial system. Every fermented bean that survived the grueling march to the high plateau became a unit of measurable, undeniable wealth. It was a currency that could not be mined from the rock, only grown in the dirt and protected by the sword. And once a botanical organ becomes the absolute standard of imperial wealth, human life is rapidly reduced to a fraction of its yield. The stage was set for a market where flesh could be weighed against seed. In the grand market of Tlatelolco, the empire operated not on faith, but on a strict, unyielding ledger. You do not think of the fragile fermented seed in your pantry as a coin that could purchase flesh, but the Aztec tax collectors recognized no other standard. The conversion rates were absolute, dictated by the state and enforced by the threat of summary execution. A single cacao bean could buy a large ripe avocado or a heavy tomato. 3 beans purchased a turkey egg. 30 beans secured a small rabbit for the fire. But the true gravity of this botanical economy revealed itself in the human arithmetic. For exactly 100 beans, you could purchase a captive adult. 100 dried seeds for a beating human heart. Today, a standard premium chocolate bar contains roughly 400 crushed beans, meaning that with every casual bite you take after dinner, you are consuming the historical equivalent of human collateral multiplied by 4. This was an economy built entirely on the friction of biological scarcity. The seeds degraded. They could rot in the suffocating tropical humidity. They could be crushed in transit under the sheer physical weight of the porters hauling them up the mountains. They were a currency that held a biological expiration date, requiring a constant, violent influx of fresh tribute from the conquered coastal provinces just to keep the central imperial economy from collapsing. The official tribute rolls of the empire demanded millions of these seeds annually. They flowed upward into the capital like an arterial hemorrhage, a relentless extraction of wealth measured out in handfuls of bitter currency. And precisely because the seed was capital, it attracted the inevitable parasite of any sophisticated financial system. It birthed the counterfeiter. In the shadowed alleys branching off the main causeways of the capital, a specialized criminal class engaged in a microscopic act of economic sabotage. They would take a genuine cacao bean and carefully peel back its paper-thin husk. Using bone needles and supreme patience, they extracted the heavy, fat-rich purple interior. To replace the mass, they meticulously packed the empty shell with finely sifted dirt, gray ash, and the dry dust of ground avocado pits. They sealed the fractured casing so perfectly that the manipulated bean could pass undetected through the rigorous physical inspections of the imperial tax collectors. It carried the smell of damp earth and calculated treason. It was not a culinary trick. It was state forgery. The penalty for passing fraudulent currency into the emperor's treasury was death, yet the practice thrived in the dark. The counterfeiters understood that the true power of the bean lay not in its chemical properties, but in the unquestioned authority it represented. They were trading in the physical illusion of power. The empire was being hollowed out from the inside, filled with ash, and traded back to itself in the open market. This was the highly engineered, ruthlessly quantified civilization that confronted the vanguard of European expansion. When Hernán Cortés and his heavily armed expeditionary force finally breached the defenses of Tenochtitlan, they were driven by a singular, consuming hunger for precious metals. They slaughtered their way through the causeways, expecting to loot a capital shimmering with silver bullion and stacked with gold ingots. They tore through the administrative heart of the palace, breaching the heavy wooden doors of Moctezuma's central treasury. Inside, they found no shimmering mountains of coin. They found deep, dry stone vaults packed floor to ceiling with woven wicker baskets. Inside those massive baskets lay millions upon millions of dried cacao seeds. The treasury breathed the smell of stale dust, dried vegetable fat, and dead empire. The gold had failed. The bitter seed did not. At first, the armored mercenaries from Castile were deeply confused. They stood in the dim light of the looted vaults, heavy iron boots crushing the spilled, dark, wrinkled almonds on the floor, struggling to comprehend a financial system anchored in rotting vegetation rather than permanent metal. But Cortés was a brilliant, pragmatic strategist of war. He quickly recognized that whoever controlled the vaults of dust controlled the surviving infrastructure of Mesoamerica. You did not need gold to command the local workforce if that workforce was already biologically and politically conditioned to bleed for the seed. He ordered his men to guard the stockpiles with the exact same lethal force they would apply to the royal mint in Madrid. The conquering forces seamlessly adopted the Aztec ledger. Spanish colonial administrators began paying their native laborers in the very same currency that had been looted from their own ancestral treasuries. The physical blood of the earth had been successfully expropriated. The transition was total, cold, and devastatingly efficient. The European invaders were not just securing a new botanical specimen. They were weaponizing an indigenous financial system to enslave the very people who had invented it. The Spanish crown did not merely adopt the captured currency of Tenochtitlan. They threw a naval blockade around it. For nearly a century following the collapse of the Aztec state, the existence of the cacao seed was treated as classified military intelligence. The Habsburg monarchs of Spain recognized that they held a monopoly on a deeply addictive, highly stimulating botanical asset, and they guarded that monopoly with the full artillery of the Atlantic fleet. The rest of the European continent was locked out. English privateers and French corsairs who intercepted Spanish galleons returning from the Americas would tear through the cargo holds in search of silver ingots. When they breached the heavy wooden crates and found only thousands of dark, wrinkled seeds, they burned the ships in disgust, entirely unaware that they were setting fire to the supreme currency of a fallen empire. They dismissed the beans as sheep droppings, leaving millions in uncounted wealth to sink into the Atlantic Trench. It was a staggering failure of geopolitical calculation. But how long can an empire contain a botanical contagion before the sheer volume of production forces the gates open? The breach occurred through the fortified harbor of Seville. By the late 16th century, the demand for the bitter drink among the Spanish aristocracy had mutated from an exotic curiosity to an institutional necessity. The elite classes of Madrid and Toledo required an unbroken supply line of the dark stimulant. To meet that demand, the colonial apparatus had to shift from local extortion to mass transatlantic shipment. In the autumn of 1585, the first dedicated, large-scale commercial cargo of cacao cleared the maritime gauntlet and dropped anchor in Seville. The docking of that specific fleet fundamentally altered the olfactory footprint of the European continent. The port of Seville was already a chaotic theater of imperial logistics. It carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of damp gunpowder from the shore batteries, the rotting timber of exhausted ship hulls, and the rancid roasted animal fat used to grease the massive iron winch mechanisms. But as the iron crowbars pried open the wooden crates on the stone docks, a new element cut through the industrial decay. It was the sharp, dense smell of fermented tropical dust. It carried the scent of damp earth and raw empire, packed tightly into the holds of deep-water vessels. Dozens of dock workers dragged the heavy burlap-wrapped bales across the wet cobblestones, leaving a faint trail of purple-brown powder in the grooves of the masonry. The biological ledger of Moctezuma had officially crossed the ocean. The isolated Mesoamerican ritual was now a global commodity in motion, measured in registered tonnage and shipping manifests. Yet, the fluid poured in the aristocratic salons of Spain required a terrifying friction of human flesh to produce. The heavy galleons arriving in Seville were not filled by the natural bounty of a passive landscape. They were filled by the catastrophic exploitation of indigenous labor in the tropical heat of Nueva España. The casual consumer today assumes that the agricultural machinery of the past was simply a slower, quieter version of the present. It was not an agricultural system, it was a demographic meat grinder. To flood the ports of Spain with enough cacao to satisfy the swelling aristocratic addiction, the colonial governors instituted the encomienda system, a legalized framework for mass enslavement. The indigenous populations of modern-day Mexico and Guatemala, already surviving the devastating shockwaves of introduced European plagues, were forced deep into the stifling, humid canopy of the equatorial plantations. They worked under the constant threat of the Spanish lash, stripping the heavy, swollen pods from the trunks of the trees, their hands permanently stained purple with the oxidized juice of the crushed pulp. You sit in a climate-controlled room today, snapping off a pristine square of chocolate, oblivious to the fact that the genetic ancestors of that very bar were watered by forced labor under a suffocating sun. The European nobility sipped their hot, frothy beverages from delicate porcelain cups, entirely insulated from the thousands of miles of bleeding hands, shattered spines, and exhausted lungs required to harvest the bitter seed. The violence was geographically quarantined. The physical brutality remained locked in the Mesoamerican dirt, while only the refined, stimulating product arrived in the manicured courts of the Old World. The secret of the Spanish monopoly was finally broken, not by military espionage, but by the sheer, crushing tonnage of the cargo moving across the Atlantic. The scale of the bloodshed had forced the imperial vaults open. This architecture of hidden suffering is not a relic of the 16th century. It is the blueprint of the modern global food system. If you want to continue examining the historical ledgers and unearthing the geopolitical cost of your pantry, subscribe to the channel. As the 17th century dawned, the heavily guarded borders of the Spanish monopoly began to inevitably fray. Smugglers, rogue merchants, and strategic dynastic marriages carried the bitter paste across the Pyrenees and into the royal courts of France, Italy, and eventually the damp, smoky coffee houses of London. But the drink that spread across the European continent was already mutating. The violent, chili-spiked, pitch-black liquid of the Aztec military command was too harsh, too abrasive for the palates of the European elite. They began to heavily doctor the dark brew. They stripped away the wild indigenous flowers and the aggressive bite of the local peppers. In their place, they injected exotic spices imported from the brutalized trade routes of the East Indies. More importantly, they began to cut the intense bitterness of the cacao with massive, unprecedented quantities of refined cane sugar. Crystallized sweetness driven by its own parallel engine of transatlantic slavery. The drink was losing its Mesoamerican identity. It was being softened, domesticated, and tailored to fit the velvet-lined drawing rooms of a continent that had no understanding of its sacred origins. The divine blood of the earth was being systematically diluted into a fashionable morning stimulant. The raw biological power of the seed was being tamed, engineered away from the battlefield and into the parlor. And in that systematic taming, the foundation was being laid for a mechanical autopsy that would dissect the bean entirely. The aristocratic parlors of Europe were consuming a compromised version of the Aztec ledger, but it was still a fluid. It was still bound by the physical limitations of boiling water and heavy porcelain. To conquer the global market, the corporate architects of the 19th century realized they had to break the fundamental biology of the seed. They had to violently alter its internal structure. How does a frothing, fatty, ceremonial liquid harden into the sterile, uniform block wrapped in foil currently sitting in your pantry? By subjecting the captured botanical asset to the crushing force of the Industrial Revolution. The year is 1828. The location is Amsterdam. The dense air of the Dutch capital smelled of coal smoke, freezing canal water, and wet iron. In a cramped, soot-stained workshop, a chemist named Conrad von Houten engineered the execution of the Mesoamerican beverage. He did not use a blade. He used a hydraulic press. Van Houten designed a towering apparatus of cast iron and heavy pistons, built to apply devastating mechanical friction to the roasted beans. The natural cacao seed is almost half pure vegetable fat, a heavy, pale grease that made the traditional drink dense and unpredictable. The European digestive system found it taxing. The corporate ledgers found it fundamentally inefficient. The machine was a weapon of dissection. When the raw ground paste was loaded into the iron cylinder, the hydraulic piston drove downward with hundreds of pounds of localized pressure. The anatomy of the seed was literally torn apart. On one side of the press, the heavy yellow fat bled out through fine iron meshes, pooling in metal vats like rendered tallow. What remained locked inside the crushing chamber was a hardened, brittle disk of pure botanical skeleton. The fat had been completely divorced from the solid matter. This was the hydraulic autopsy of a sacred fruit. Van Houten took that dry, compressed disk and pulverized it. He treated the resulting dust with alkaline salts, stripping away the final traces of its indigenous acidic bite. The resulting substance was a fine, soluble powder that mixed effortlessly into hot water, leaving no trace of the heavy grease that had coated the teeth of Moctezuma's generals. It was the complete structural death of the original beverage. The Dutch press did not just alter the physical texture of the commodity. It shattered the economic ceiling of its distribution. By extracting the unpredictable fat and neutralizing the wild acidity, Van Houten standardized the crop. The powder could now be packed into dry tin canisters, loaded into the dark crevices of steamships, and shipped across oceans without the constant risk of rancidity. It was stripped of its biological volatility. It was no longer a fragile tropical fruit. It was a stable, predictable industrial asset, ready to be leveraged on a massive intercontinental scale. But the final fatal mutation of the Aztec currency did not happen in the Netherlands. It happened 19 years later inside the blackened brick factories of England. In 1847, the port city of Bristol was a suffocating grid of cobblestones, coal ash, and extreme wealth generated by the Atlantic slave trade. Operating within this geography of empire was the firm of J.S. Fry & Sons. The corporate executives at Fry looked at the separated components of Van Houten's invention, the dry powder and the isolated vats of pale yellow fat, and executed a new, terrifying calculation. They realized that if you took the pulverized skeleton of the seed, flooded it with massive volumes of cheap colonial sugar, and then deliberately re-injected a surplus of the extracted cocoa butter, the chemistry inverted. It was no longer a powder waiting for water. It became a thick, glossy paste that could be poured directly into heavy lead molds. As the ambient temperature of the English factory cooled the lead, the fat crystallized and locked the sugar and dust together. They pulled the solid blocks from the iron racks. It was the first chocolate bar. It was not a drink of the gods. It was a portable brick of calories and corporate engineering. The invention by J.S. Fry & Sons fundamentally reorganized the relationship between human biology and the captured seed. You no longer needed a cup, a fire, or the forced labor of a household servant to prepare the dose. You could carry the compressed energy of the equatorial tropics in your coat pocket. The injection of immense quantities of sugar masked the inherent bitterness of the original plant entirely, tricking the brain into categorizing a harsh botanical stimulant as an innocent comfort. The solid bar was packaged, branded, and sold by the thousands to the expanding industrial working classes of Europe who required cheap, high-density energy to survive the brutal shifts of the factory floor. The transition was absolute. The weaponized currency of Tenochtitlan had been successfully domesticated into a cheap, mass-produced commodity. But this mechanical triumph triggered a catastrophic logistical problem. The invention of the solid bar caused consumer demand to explode exponentially. The European factories were no longer processing enough seeds to supply a few thousand aristocratic salons. They were now melting down millions of tons to feed the mechanized sugar addiction of entire nations. The surviving plantations of the Americas, even with their brutalized indigenous labor forces, could not output the necessary tonnage to keep the iron molds of Bristol and Amsterdam full. The crop was dying under the weight of its own commercial success. The corporate architecture required a new geography of extraction. To maintain the artificially low price of the solid bar that now sits seamlessly on the modern supermarket shelf, the industry had to locate a vast, unregulated territory where human flesh could be consumed by the agricultural machine even faster than it had been in the jungles of Nueva España. The solution to this corporate deficit was found across the Atlantic, on the fever-damp coast of West Africa. The major European powers were already engaged in the ruthless carving up of the African continent. They looked at the heavy equatorial heat, the deep canopy of the jungle, and saw a perfect, unmonitored greenhouse for the displaced Mesoamerican seed. The botanical engine of the Aztec Empire was ripped from its native soil and transplanted into the volcanic dirt of the Gulf of Guinea. The islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, small, jagged outcroppings of basalt rising from the Atlantic, were entirely repurposed. They ceased to be mere navigational waypoints. They were converted into massive, enclosed agricultural factories dedicated solely to the extraction of the bitter pod. The logistics of this new empire were absolute. The European corporate boards did not need to negotiate with indigenous kings or navigate complex diplomatic treaties. They simply applied the brutal mathematics of colonial shipping. To fill the gaping iron mouths of the hydraulic presses in Amsterdam and the lead molds in Bristol, thousands of tons of raw material had to cross the ocean every month. And to harvest those thousands of tons, the plantations required a massive disposable workforce. The indigenous populations of the Americas had been decimated, but the interior of the African continent offered an inexhaustible reservoir of human capital. Men and women were funneled from the deep interior of Angola, shackled in the holds of coastal steamers, and dumped onto the black volcanic beaches of São Tomé. They were officially categorized as contract laborers.
It was a bureaucratic lie, written in clean ink on colonial manifests to satisfy the moral vanity of the European consumer. They were slaves, dying in the shadows of the cacao trees. The mortality rate on the Portuguese islands was staggering. The workers were broken by the suffocating humidity, crippled by tropical diseases, and worked to the point of structural collapse under the heavy pods. The harvested seeds were piled into massive, rotting mounds, fermented in the heat, and dried on the volcanic stones before being shoveled into burlap sacks. The smell of the docks in São Tomé was a thick, suffocating blend of rotting fruit pulp, human sweat, and wet iron. It was the exact same biological friction that had built Tenochtitlan, simply scaled up by the cold mechanics of 20th century maritime logistics. The European public, happily snapping off squares of sweetened, mass-produced chocolate in their drawing rooms, remained deliberately blind to the hemorrhage of human life sustaining their habit. But a supply chain built entirely on human attrition eventually leaves a paper trail too massive to hide. The year is 1905. The coastal humidity of Angola smells of malaria and stagnant water. An English investigative journalist named Henry Nevinson steps onto the docks, carrying a notebook and a mandate to examine the hidden ledgers of the agricultural empires. He follows the supply lines backward, from the polite shipping offices of the coast deep into the brutalized interior, and eventually across the water to the isolated plantations of São Tomé. Nevinson does not find a modern, regulated workforce. He finds an archipelago of systematic death. He documents the exact mechanics of the lie. He records the names of the dead, the tonnage of the shipments, and the agonizing physical decay of the workers who are legally bound to the trees until their bodies fail. Nevinson discovers that the massive, reputable chocolate manufacturers of England, the very companies that pioneered the solid sweetened bar, are directly purchasing the harvest of this captive labor force. The polished, foil-wrapped bricks of calories sold in the pristine storefronts of London are being subsidized entirely by the blood of Angolan captives. The corporate facade fractured. The bitter seed was exposed, once again as an instrument of human subjugation. You walk down the blindingly lit aisle of your local supermarket today. The air conditioning is perfectly calibrated. The shelves are mathematically organized, offering dozens of competing brands stacked in neat, colorful rows. You pick up a heavy, solid bar wrapped in a thin, reflective skin of aluminum. The packaging speaks of smooth textures and ethical sourcing. The marketing copy is designed to soothe, to insulate you completely from the dirt, the heat, and the history of the botanical asset inside. The industrial machinery has done its job perfectly. It has bleached the violence out of the product. But the biology of the tree remains unchanged. The heavy pods still grow directly from the trunk, hanging like swollen organs in the equatorial heat. They still require the grueling, manual labor of human hands wielding steel blades to crack the thick husks. The modern supply chains have simply shifted the coordinates of the friction, hiding the exploitation deeper within the borders of West Africa, shielding the consumer from the agonizing economic reality of the global harvest. The price of the commodity is still artificially suppressed by the desperation of the people who pull it from the dirt. The corporate ledgers of the 21st century are just as ruthless as the tribute rolls of Moctezuma. By mechanically crushing its sacred essence, flooding it with sugar, and shifting the brutality from the Aztec altar to the hidden plantations of the modern supply chain, the empire never actually died. It just changed its packaging.
Every time you unwrap a chocolate bar, you are holding the domesticated corpse of an empire. Next week, we open a different ledger: how a single spice bankrupted a European kingdom and drew the borders of the modern map. Until then, keep questioning what you consume.